I see you go to, XYZ non-target school. Well, we have a bunch of candidates applying from Harvard and Stanford and Yale and all these schools. So like, why should we hire you over them? That's a strength question, right? And so you got to be able to recognize that when you're going through the interview so that you know what they're really getting at. Hey guys, if you like the content on this episode today, I want you to go and click the subscribe button to make sure that you get all of our future content as well, because I've been putting out probably 3 of these episodes every single week, all with investment banking recruiting advice that's going to benefit you and help you get that job that you want. Okay, so go and click the subscribe button now. Now, for today, what I want to talk about is the 5 most common types of investment banking behavioral questions that you should expect to get in an interview. Okay, I've talked about this previously in another episode where I said that one of the most common mistakes that we see for why people struggle with behavioral interviews is because they don't know what questions to expect on the interview. So more than half the time when people mess up during a behavioral interview, it's because they get asked a question that they weren't expecting, right? And when an interviewer asks you a question that you weren't expecting, or you think, they just threw a curveball at you, oftentimes people freeze up and they don't know how to respond. Then they start stuttering, and then they eventually, force themselves to come up with some sort of answer on the spot. And the interviewer can tell when you're just kind of making stuff up on the fly, right? Unless you're just like really good at doing stuff like that, but most people are not, right? And so this is one of the most common pitfalls that we see with investment banking interviews. And so today I just want to kind of help you with that by giving you a heads up on kind of like what are the most common behavioral interview questions that you might get asked. Now, we're not going to go through like every single question. Obviously, like there's technically an unlimited number of questions that they could possibly ask you, right? So that's not the point of this exercise. But I do want to kind of bucket these questions into the 5 major categories so that you know kind of like how to think about it, okay? So the first one is what we call the guaranteed questions, all right? So in terms of the guaranteed questions, there's really 3 of them in here. There's tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. This one is like always gets asked, probably one of the first questions, right? So you got to have a good answer for that. It really establishes your first impression to the interviewer, right? So also, why do you want to do investment banking? You obviously got to know that. And then why do you want to work for our bank specifically? Like, what's the difference between, Goldman Sachs versus Morgan Stanley versus JP Morgan versus Deutsche Bank, right? And so those are, kind of like the holy trinity or the guaranteed questions, at least as far as we're concerned. And so every single candidate that we work with, like you have to make sure your answers for those 3 questions are amazing, okay? So that's the first category. The second category is what I call resume questions. So obviously for resume questions, every time you interview, they're going to have your resume in front of them, right? And so whatever it is that you're representing in your resume in terms of experiences that you've had in the past and things that you've done, you're going to have to be prepared to talk about each of those experiences in detail. I talked about this in another episode. I talked about like what not to put on your resume, and the things that you don't want to put on your resume are the things that you can't talk about intelligently, right? Or sometimes people make the mistake of making stuff up on their resume or exaggerating on their resume, and sometimes it's really obvious when you do that, and the bankers can tell when someone's probably lying, right? And so if they drill down and start asking you a bunch of follow-up questions about something that you said you did or about a specific bullet point that you wrote, you got to be prepared to answer those questions, okay? The other reason why people trip up on the resume questions a lot is, quite frankly, because their resume is kind of weak. Like they don't have a lot of relevant experience to talk about, right? And so that's why it's so important to build up your resume too, not just so that you have a resume that looks good, but also because it's going to serve as the foundation of a lot of your answers during your actual interview, and it's going to also kind of steer the interview in the direction that you want it to go in, right? So what you put on the resume has to be strategic, okay? The third group is what I call strengths and weaknesses questions. So this is pretty straightforward, but they're going to ask you about your strengths and they're going to ask you about your weaknesses, right? Sometimes they're going to ask for multiple strengths and multiple weaknesses. So you want to have more than one prepared, okay? Or sometimes you give them one, they don't really like it, they'll ask you for another one, right? And sometimes they also won't ask you these questions in like a super straightforward way. They won't just say like, hey, so what is your greatest weakness, right? They might ask you in like a different way. So for example, hey, what is your, what is like one thing, what is your biggest failure that you've ever had? Like that could be a weakness question, right? Or, hey, if I were to talk to your former boss, what would they tell me about you? Like that could be a strength or a weakness question, or both, right? And so there's other ways that they could ask these questions. Are like, hey, I see you go to, XYZ non-target school. Well, we have a bunch of candidates applying from Harvard and Stanford and Yale and all these schools. So like, why should we hire you over them? That's a strength question, right? And so you got to be able to recognize that when you're going through the interview, so that you know what they're really getting at. And otherwise, sometimes what will happen is when they ask you in a different way than what you're expecting, a lot of people kind of get caught off guard and they freeze up, and then they kind of get thrown off, right? And so that's the third bucket. The fourth bucket is what I call situational questions. So this is like questions that start with, tell me about a time when ... right? Like, so tell me about a time when you demonstrated leadership. Tell me about a time when you overcame a challenge. Tell me about a time when you had to work in teams. Tell me about a time when you, had a failure, when you failed at something. Tell me about a time when you had to work under really tight deadlines. Tell me about a time when you couldn't finish your work on time. Could be whatever, right? But of course, there's a certain set of situational questions that banks are more likely to ask, because ultimately it doesn't make sense for them to ask you about situations that they don't care about, right? There are certain traits and qualities that they care about and that they're looking for in their hires, and those are typically the type of situations that they're going to ask you for. And so for each of these situations, you want to have a good example prepared that you can basically use in your interviews. Okay. The last type of question here is market related questions. So these are this is even more important if you're going for like sales and trading and stuff. But even in investment banking, they're going to want to know that you follow the markets. They want to know what's going on in the economy. They want to know that you've been following the transactions that have been going on in the space, especially if you're interviewing with the industry specific group, or maybe like a smaller bank that focuses on a certain niche, that you're going to want to know the deals that have been happening in their specific space, right? Whether it's IPOs or M&A deals. Also, the trends that are going on in that market or in that industry. Who the players are. Having stock pitches prepared, both maybe on the long side and the short side. So there's a lot of different types of market related questions that they could ask you. And so you got to be prepared for that. This is one area where I feel like a lot of students are just totally unprepared in, because they didn't even know that they had to know this stuff, right? So those are the 5 categories of questions that you really got to know. And look, like within each of these categories, obviously we can get more granular and go into, all the different types of questions that they can ask under each bucket. I might do that in another episode on another day, but just for now, just know that these are the 5 things. Make sure you check your boxes on these. And then, if you have good answers prepared for these, you're going to be in pretty good shape for your behavioral interviews. Okay. Of course, there's like other things like occasional brain teaser, although I believe those are becoming less and less popular over time, and stuff like that. But if you know these, then you're going to be probably in better shape than 90% of the people out there. Okay, so hopefully that helps you guys. Hey there, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're looking for more customized advice that's tailored for your specific situation, then I invite you to book a free strategy session with our team at the link below. We'll talk to you soon.